All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. So thank you so much for your interest in our symposium. This is short? Okay. So, all right, we are having a symposium. We're talking about different perspectives on collision risk modeling. Collision risk modeling is a challenging statistical thing to do and also a challenging thing to implement in terms of like a regulatory practice. And so today what we're hoping to do is have a discussion between some folks who are more thinking about how to implement these models, some folks who are thinking about how to create these models, and just give some perspectives on how they're being used both in North America and over in Europe. And so hopefully this leads to some useful discussion. We'll have 5 presentations today and then a panel discussion afterwards. If this isn't enough CRM stuff for you, we're going to have we have a workshop, a working group meeting tomorrow afternoon for all interested, and you can come by there and talk to us then. I'll probably keep mentioning that. But first, we have Aonghais, Aonghais Cook from the Biodiversity Consultancy, and he's going to be talking about a review of collision risk models.
Thanks, Evan. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of give a bit of a background of collision risk models and talk about a bit about how they've developed and some of the sort of aspects of them that maybe cause a bit of difficulty and some of the sort of challenges with trying to sort of move them forward a bit. Well. Go. Cool. So, believe it or not, I was quite shocked to find out last year that collision risk models are actually about 40 years old. The first ones were developed back in 1983 with a view to just trying to understand a bit more about what types of risks the turbines might pose to birds, and sort of really generally very simple ones. It's only since about the year 2000 that collision risk models have been used in an EIA context. So the first one was sort of developed by Scottish Natural Heritage with a view to trying to understand what the risk to geese moving between their roosting sites and their foraging areas were. And since then, they've become sort of fairly well established and widely used as part of impact assessments. And since 2000, sort of reflecting this sort of more applied usage, the sort of number and types of models has sort of increased fairly dramatically. So the very, very first CRM was actually pretty simple. It was just that it just sort of works out the probability of a bird colliding based on the number of blades, the speed that those blades are travelling at, and then the size and the speed of the bird, and basically works out the probability of the bird and the blade being in the same place at the same time and causing a collision. And actually, a lot of the models that have been developed since then sort of follow this sort of very, very similar pattern. They use the same types of logic, but are sort of start bringing in a bit more maths, a bit more additional parameters, and trying to sort of bring a bit more sort of biological reality into it. And as a result of that, we've got to this sort of situation now. So this is a sort of the typical parameters that get used in a lot of the collision risk models. So you can see this sort of, it's gone from the previous model where there's maybe 5 or 6 parameters to this sort of huge array of parameters related to the bird and the turbines, and some of which that we're able to quantify pretty well. Others which have quite a high degree of uncertainty surrounding them, making it sort of quite challenging to sort of properly capture that uncertainty and get a good handle on what the collision rate might be. The models themselves, actually, quite often, a lot of the ones that have been developed and put out there in the literature are sort of fairly poorly documented, which makes it quite hard to use them. I think increasingly over the last few years, though, I think there's been a trend to do things using packages like R, or sort of moving on from Excel Visual Basic and things like that, which sort of makes the models themselves a bit more transparent, a bit easier to use, and it sort of helps sort of make things a bit clearer for decision makers and other stakeholders that are trying to understand what's going on with collision. So across the models that we reviewed, we identified 75 different parameters that were used in one or more of them. And the sort of range between the models from sort of 3 to 22 parameters, which again, that sort of starts giving you an understanding of how some of this uncertainty can get introduced, some of the challenges in actually quantifying the things that go into the models. I think the models themselves, they sort of split between two different categories. So you've got the sort of simpler ones that are maybe based on just sort of understanding species habitat and how that overlaps with a wind farm, and therefore what the sort of risk and the exposure of a bird is, to these more complicated ones that maybe have a lot more parameters and start trying to go through a few more steps to sort of work out the overall collision risk. Sort of often things like individual-based models and things like that. Those parameters themselves, actually, they're quite often based on sort of fairly old data sets. So things like the flight speeds, often based on a study carried out in Norway, where they use sort of ornithodolites to try and track bird speeds and measure speeds that way. Often, actually, a lot of the species on that have fairly low sample sizes, so it's difficult to understand how representative those data might be. The flight height stuff is often based on a study that I was involved in at BTO, looking at flight height data collected from boat-based survey data, and I think at the time that was a really good data set, but I think things have moved on since then. We're able to use technology like GPS tags, radar, things like that to measure species flight heights, but that's not necessarily getting used in the assessment process. And then avoidance rates as well, and this is a sort of big catch-all parameter that sort of poses huge challenges. There's a lot of uncertainty around it, and it's sort of often measured by comparing observed collisions to those predicted in the absence of avoidance. So there's a sort of certain circularity there as well, which sort of, again, brings in this sort of confusion. So, as I said, we're now able to collect more and more evidence from operational wind farms using technology like radar and GPS, so giving us a much better understanding of things like weather conditions and time of day, as well as improved parameterization. And that type of data is sort of increasingly getting used in sort of things like individual-based models. So that, like this example from the Netherlands, where they used individual-based models based on GPS tracking data to try and get a better understanding of collision risk in the offshore in the breeding season. But those models are quite data intensive, and it's not a sort of all or nothing type approach. I think there are still things that we can do to make use of these data. So simpler approaches using these data, things like a model from the US looking at terns and using the GPS data to get an understanding of sort of bearing and distance to relate to collision risk. Or there's other models like bringing in information from observed collision rates. And then there's later talks by Andrew and Elizabeth later on that also describe a couple of other models. But generally, I think collision models are becoming a fairly central part of the assessment process for offshore wind. The BAN model and its variants are probably still the most widely used, but a lot of new models are being developed which are able to make much better use of some of the data that have been collected using model technology. So thanks.
All right. Next up, we're going to have Julie Miller, who's going to be talking about some perspectives on collision risk and assessment for offshore wind development in the UK.
It's all. Fab. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm Julie Miller. I'm a marine ornithologist at the Marine Directorate, which used to be called Marine Scotland. So the kind of background, I'm going to talk to you about our collision assessment and more generally about offshore wind development in Scotland. Background to our kind of offshore renewables drive is that there's a policy in the Scottish Government to reach a target of net zero by 2045. And across our kind of who's who in our processes, we have Crown Estate Scotland, so they are responsible for seabed leasing. And then we have Scottish ministers who are ultimately responsible for the kind of planning, regulation and delivery of offshore wind. But they have lots of teams advising them. We have a planning team in the Offshore Wind Directorate and the regulatory team in our lot licensing operations team who sit with us in the Marine Directorate. And I work in this yellow highlighted group in the Marine Directorate called Science, Evidence, Digital and Data. It's quite pithy, that title. It used to be called Marine Scotland Science. And we also work with statutory nature consultation bodies. So an important one we highlight here, or I highlight here in kind of pinky purple, is Nature Scot, and they're charged as the official advisors to the Scottish Government on all matters concerning nature. And we have our non-statutory consultees. So for me, in ornithology, RSPB are one of our important ones, but there are many, many others. So that's kind of background layout to it. And in Scotland, our planning teams do spatial marine planning for all activities in Scottish waters. So we have marine spatial plans for offshore wind development, which try and identify those areas suitable for sort of sustainable commercial rollout, commercial scale offshore wind development. We're currently in a ScotWind leasing round, that's what it's called just now. That's highlighted on the left-hand side of this slide, again in this pinky purple, what is that colour, of these areas, which are currently scoping and actively looking at projects. And we also have this, another name, ENTOG, which is Energy for Innovation and Targeted Oil and Gas Decarbonisation, who comes up with this. And there's a marine plan for that as well, and that's, again, another sort of renewables drive. And together, these two initiatives hope to contribute to that target of net zero. Our current picture of offshore wind in Scotland, so we have about 7-8 gig of offshore renewables consented or operational at the moment around Scotland. Most of that from fixed wind. Our ScotWind round that I mentioned earlier is looking at about 27.6 gigawatts across 20 projects that are fixed and floating. And then ENTOG is looking at about 5.5 gig of projects, and that's all floating at the moment. So our background process is built, as you might expect, on legislation, and we're kind of interested in looking at those sites, particularly under the habitats regulations, which are, for seabirds, our special protection areas. And there we look at our sites and species, and we assess impacts both alone from projects and then cumulatively as well. As you can see, we've got quite a lot going on in the waters around Scotland. There's loads more happening in our neighbours in England and Wales. So cumulative impacts are really beginning to be very important and might trigger derogations where we need to start thinking about compensation from impacts as well. Our unit of currency really in assessments is population level. These special protection areas work at the sort of unit of measurement of populations. So we go around our assessments, or the developers submit their applications and their assessments, looking at that sort of pathway to impact. So what's the spatial and temporal connectivity these sites and species we're interested in have with proposed developments? And then we expect them to quantify displacement and collision impacts based on a species ecology. Is it going to be vulnerable to displacement, collision, or both? And then we'll look at that in terms of these individuals from their respective sites and colonies at a population level and try and understand whether or not there's an adverse impact to the population by comparing unimpacted population models with the impacted ones from that displacement and collision. But we know fundamentally we don't have perfect knowledge of seabird ecology or indeed the tools we use to deliver these quantifications. But we're quite fortunate in the Scottish Government that we have a funded research programme called the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, or ScotMER. And it has two sort of primary roles, so to identify and prioritise knowledge gaps, which we do with lots of stakeholders, and then we commission and design research to address these knowledge gaps as well. How does this work in terms of collision? So as I mentioned earlier, our colleagues at Nature Scot, they produce all the guidance for developers to undertake their assessments, and we try and update where we can evidence base and tools that might be useful for assessment as well to improve the process and our understanding. So for collision risk, Angus introduced some of the models earlier. So we commissioned a project a while ago to try and improve the sort of band and Marsden models that were being used in this stochastic collision risk model and Shiny app, bringing what used to be an Excel-orientated process into the R environment, also introducing increased functionality by making the model capable of looking across the uncertainty and variability in the parameters used. We improved computational time and kind of standardized inputs and outputs to a degree and made it a bit more transparent as well. We're also currently, there's a project ongoing in the Marine Directorate where we're making another version of this for migratory species as well. We also know, as well as our tools, we have fundamental gaps in our knowledge in terms of ecology. So we commission lots of projects as well, looking at things like gathering information on avoidance rates, flight heights, regional baseline density studies, etc., to try and improve our knowledge sphere and improve our assessments. I mentioned earlier we're also very interested in our cumulative impacts. This is really key at the moment. We do have another project underway that should finish hopefully soon, called the Cumulative Effects Framework. And what this project is doing is it's bringing together in that kind of pale green there all the tools that we use to quantify our assessment impacts in the same environment, again in the R language. And it will also have data libraries of all the ecological parameters that we use for each species and sites. And it will also have libraries on all the existing and consented and operational wind farms as well. So we have everything in one place that developers, when they're undertaking their assessment, can use as a standardized approach. So thank you. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour around what we do at Scottish Government, what we do within my group and team. We have this advice and research role and our ScotMare programme, and we also collaborate very willingly with other research programmes and partners. So thank you for listening. Thanks.
All right. So as we have short talks, so we can have more conversation. Also, I think maroon maybe is what you're looking for. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm sorry, it's pinky purple. Excuse me. Next up, we have Stephanie Vail-Muse, who's talking about offshore wind planning and decision in the U.S.
Hello, everyone. Stephanie Vail-Muse, Regional Energy Coordinator with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of Ecological Services for the Northeast region. Today's discussion is going to focus on the steps the Northeast region is taking to assist the administration in meeting its offshore wind energy targets and our plan to address the associated impacts to our listed species. As you know, offshore wind energy development is progressing in most U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions. And the administration has set an ambitious goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. This initiative aims to boost renewable energy, create jobs, and promote environmental sustainability. Achieving this requires a comprehensive regulatory framework involving multiple agencies and laws. There they are. And specifically, the action agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, they manage the leases on the Outer Continental Shelf, and they conduct the environmental assessments. Our responsibility within the Fish and Wildlife Service is to ensure compliance with our regulatory authorities, particularly the Section 7 under the Endangered Species Act, and to protect, which is the mission is to protect threatened and endangered species and their habitats. We play a really critical role in ensuring offshore wind projects comply with the Endangered Species Act. The Section 7 consultations process is essential for assessing the potential impacts on endangered and threatened species, and we work closely with project developers to identify options for avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts, which is basically to ensure that any take of the listed species is incidental and does not jeopardize their survival. Key species that we're focused on in the Northeast region, but is not limited to other regions. So this is just, Northeast, it's the piping plover, the roseate tern, and the rufous red knot. If you go down to Region 4, the southeast, then they also have the black-capped petrels. And as other regions come on board with offshore wind, additional species and consultations will need to take place to address those impacts and to try and identify what can be done to avoid and minimize them. So our development proceeds, our goal is to ensure that offshore wind development proceeds responsibly, protecting these vulnerable species while advancing the renewable energy goals of the administration. The outcomes of these consultations are documented in biological assessments and biological opinions, which guide the development and the implementation of our mitigation measures. So to accurately assess the impact of offshore wind projects on birds, the Northeast region has been relying on 2 collision risk models. The first one is the SCRAM model, and the BAND model is the second one. The SCRAM model, or the stochastic collision risk model, is it's pretty transparent. You can hop online and you can figure out how to run it and to utilize it, and you can actually generate potential impacts. And it's basically, it's novel and it's new. All right, so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it is, in the service's opinion, the best available scientific information, and that's what we're using. Now, in areas that the SCRAM model isn't applicable, maybe because we don't have a lot of data, we're utilizing BAND, and in areas where we have both, we utilize both. So it just kind of depends on where you're at on the OCS, depending upon which models we're going to use. But we're hopeful that it's going to continue to be expanded, and we'll be able to utilize it more consistently across both the Atlantic, the Northeast, and the Southeast regions. And in our opinion, BAND actually really complements SCRAM by addressing its limitations, and it kind of helps us provide a more comprehensive risk assessment when we're looking at the BAs that BOEM submits, and that while we're drafting and issuing our biological opinions. Collision risk models are essential for our BAs and the BOs, and they help us make informed decisions and implement effective measures. Without these models, it would be incredibly challenging for the service to analyze collision risk accurately and to develop reasonable project plans with the project proponents and with the action agency. So here's our process. We have got, if we look at the collision risk models, so basically, BOEM drafts the biological assessment. Within that assessment, they identify the project description. They identify the species that they believe are going to be impacted. They utilize a tool that the Fish and Wildlife Service has. It's called IPAC. I won't break down that acronym, but it basically says, hey, FYI, these are the species, these are the threatened and listed species that you could come into contact with based on the parameters that you've inputted. And they analyze all of their, they write up and draft all of those impacts and the potential impacts and the avoidance, minimization measures, everything that the project proponent is proposing to do into a document, and that's called the biological assessment. And that is what they submit to the service. And that is what we review, read, and then, depending upon if we've determined and agree that collisions or other impacts are going to occur to our species or critical habitat, then we enter into a formal consultation and we issue a biological opinion. It's a long process. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of cooperative working relationships between the industry proponents and the action agency and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And a large part of that for our analysis is the collision risk analysis. And so anyways, let's see. The purpose of the documents is to help us ensure that we're meeting our regulatory compliance under the Section 7, under the Endangered Species Act. So when we're all working together, when we're reviewing a biological assessment, when we're issuing a biological opinion, the entire purpose is to ensure that we're not, and the project proponents are not, and the action agency is not jeopardizing the existence of a species that's already vulnerable and at risk. And that's a really critical and important mission for us, and it's also a very important mission that BOEM does when they are drafting these documents. All right, both agencies are trying to be thorough, and we're trying to make sure that we can sustainably put out these types of leases and ensure that this types of work can happen in a timely manner that also doesn't result in harm to our species. So basically, in summary, the administration's offshore wind goals represent a significant step towards a sustainable future. The regulatory framework, including Section 7 consultations and the use of collision risk models like SCRAM and BAN, ensures that we can achieve these goals responsibly. The Fish and Wildlife Service is committed to protecting our wildlife while supporting the growth of the offshore wind industry. And I thank you, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
The speed talking competition continues with Andrew Gilbert, who will be talking about SCRAM, our stochastic collision risk model that uses telemetry data here in the U.S.
Thanks, Evan. Well, he's already introduced it, so I'll move on. I actually just want to thank all of the co-authors here listed, especially Pam Lombard, our Fearless Fish and Wildlife Service officer, who's been helping us with this project, and BOEM's funding. So I just wanted to remind people who, many of you probably have heard about SCRAM, but it stems from a long lineage of models going back to the BAN model that Angus mentioned. And, we stepped through the R version of that was stochastic from Mazden, and then became a Shiny tool. And we really derived from that Shiny tool. And actually, most recently, there was an R package put out called StochLab, which is very good. And we've, in the latest version of SCRAM, which has not been released yet, but I'm going to talk about at the end here, we use the StochLab package to be, it's updated, it's faster, so it harmonizes the code with the European use of SCRAM. So, part of SCRAM, we actually have sort of 3 variants of that BAN model, and I'm just going to discuss because there's been a bit of confusion we found through time about what each of these sort of variants can do, and really all they do is vary the passage rate, and the rest of the model, which is that physical model that was described earlier, is the same. You're really just estimating how many birds are flying through or exposed in a project, and so we developed the SCRAM version, which uses migratory movement data to estimate occupancy offshore. And that gets you these passages. And then there's a band that Stephanie just mentioned this, the band model. It's actually the model they're using is the band Annex 6 migratory version. We've actually now implemented that in SCRAM, so you can access it without going through the Excel model, and actually made it stochastic. And then the third is, and through that's a more simplified model. And I'll touch on these very briefly after this. And then the band flux model is the standard seabird fluxing model. And I put this up here just to remind folks about all the parameters that go into these models, but particularly the 2 that we are working with or estimating in SCRAM, which is the flight height distribution, as well as the use offshore, the habitat use offshore. And so the next few slides really are just looking at how the data inputs are different between those 3 variants I mentioned, and then the models that go into eventually estimating the number of passes or the passage rate. And again, just to remember, that's really the physical model of collisions and things is the same with these sort of variants. It's really how you get at the number of passages and the passage rate that varies. So in SCRAM, using movement data from telemetry, both MODIS and now GPS Argos satellite telemetry data, we're generating these correlated random walk models. That gives us position estimates with uncertainty, which is important. And from that, we can generate these maps of use offshore. And that combined with population or migratory population size, which is provided by Fish and Wildlife Service. Their species leads go through this exhaustively and come up with the best estimates of migratory population size. And using that data along with the use rates, you can get at this number of passages. In the Annex 6 model, what we refer to as band Annex 6, that where you don't have that sort of movement data, but you have an estimate of what the migratory corridor looks like, you can use a very simplified version where if you also have the population size, you're basically looking at the migratory corridor width at the latitude where your project is. And that will give you, assuming a uniform distribution of birds, which we know is not accurate. I mean, we're now modeling that now. We know it's more complex than that. You can get birds per kilometer, and that's essentially your passage rate at that location. And then with the band flux model, as we like to call it, that's the standard seabird model that goes back to the 2012 version. That's for birds that are constantly moving through the environment. So think a shearwater or something like that. We don't have that implemented yet, but we put that in there because the potential is that we will eventually implement that in SCRAM, what we're calling sort of the SCRAM umbrella of tools. And to get at passage rate for that, you have your standard density surface estimates from boat surveys or aerial surveys or whatever, and then you're combining that with flight speed to look at this sort of passage through time. And so, when would you use each of these cases? Again, there was a lot of confusion about, why would you use the Annex 6 model versus using, say, SCRAM with more sophisticated data. In some cases, you're also using that to sort of bracket sort of the estimate, I think is what Fish and Wildlife Service is doing. But if you have good tracking data and you can develop good models, then you can use SCRAM to develop these occupancy models and then use this sort of more sophisticated sort of passage rate estimate to develop collision risk estimates. If you don't have that, but you have some expert knowledge or some limited data to show you what the migratory corridor is, and you can estimate a migratory width at your location, and you have good population numbers, then you can use this more simplified version of the band migrant Annex 6 model. And then the fluxing model, again, we're not implemented yet, but you would use the surface density estimates along with flight speeds and things to look at risk for, like a black cap petrel, for example. So we are now finishing up phase 2 of the SCRAM model. We totally redid the code to use the Stoke Lab, and so I just wanted to touch on a few differences that we think greatly improved it. This is just out for review. We literally finished it last week, submitted the report, which will come out in the fall. But the things that included updates are, we're continuously collecting data to put into these models to have improved model estimates. And the model, there's a lot of details in the models, we can chat about offline here, but they're now these are correlated random walk models, and the MODIS models are now single state models, which improve the model's flexibility and model fit, reduced uncertainty, and improved estimates. We also are including GPS, Argos satellite telemetry data. It's sort of different kind of modeling for that, and this is for red knots only, by the way, for the GPS data. And from that, we are doing an ensemble model, so a combination of those two. So we think that overall improves our estimates. Additionally, we're also doing flight height estimation for red knots only, because that's where we have the GPS data. We're doing we did a behavioral state space model that we think is a much better model of flight height distribution. And we are also working with some international partners on that, so sharing ideas and models to improve that. So where are we going? We're going to continue developing the web application and the models, as well, both flight height and the distribution models. And then we're going to continue working internationally, as well as domestically, on these flight height models, and as well as cumulative effects models, continued outreach, and have independent reviews. And I'm just going to put in this plug for we are actually need some assistance with some of the modeling. So, anyone who's a quantitative ecologist who's interested in joining us, please do. Oops.
All right. Last talk, we have Elizabeth Stark, who is wasn't able to make it in person, but did submit she is on Zoom for the conversation later, and she did submit this talk to us. So let's listen to Liz.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me to talk, and I'm really sorry I can't be there.
Hold on. Why isn't this mirroring? Oh, I know why. Yeah, I didn't think about this. Sorry. You can probably just throw it over there. You just need to figure out which direction it is.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to stop the share.
We just need to get
I think
this.
we need to push it over onto the right screen there.
There.
There you go. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me to talk, and I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I'm coming to you from very rainy and cold Melbourne in Australia, and I'm going to try and give you a really brief overview of a couple of the cool things that have happened in the Australian collision risk modelling landscape in the last 20 years. A little bit about my background, just so you know. I represent a company called Symbolics, and we've worked with both government and with private developers for 20 years now, doing wind and wildlife work, amongst other things, and that's sort of the lens I'm putting onto this talk today. Just to kind of ground us in where we are, this is a wind power resource map across Australia, and the squiggly lines here are our national energy grid. So, as with many things in Australia, there's always this massive trade-off between accessibility of sites. A lot of our land is very remote and very sparsely populated, but also trading off the wind resource. And so we're going to start our story today down in the south of Australia, which is really where the wind energy industry started. It starts in Tasmania, and it starts with a species called the wedge-tailed eagle. And in fact, the first job that we were involved in at Symbolics was working with collaborators at Biosis as part of their development of collision risk model. And the reason that it was needed was because the band model at the time, which was the only really other option, was really designed for migratory species. It was really a one bird, one turbine kind of setup. So we needed to develop something that would work for resident birds. So wedge-tailed eagle, you've got resident pairs, you've got floating population. They're going to be on site the whole year. They're going to interact with a number of turbines on any given flight. You've got multiple movements per individual. And because we didn't really know anything about the avoidance rates at the beginning of this adventure, having the ability to model both a static and a dynamic avoidance rate was really important in those early discussions. So this was sort of the first Australian foray into collision risk modelling, and it's still used today for all those reasons. Something else that we often do with collision risk modelling for particularly the big raptor species now is incorporate both micrositing, so per turbine collision risk assessments, and spatial. So, for example, this is a site that got its conditions of operation last week, I think, so it's hot off the press. What we did there was 24 months of survey. We had a field crew trained biologist who did point count of wedge-tailed eagle flights, and through those point counts we did a distance correction methodology and calculated flights per hectare per hour flight flux average over the whole site. On top of that, the same field crew collected data about the spatial the flight paths of those eagles. And from that, we were able to build up, using kernel methods, a probability density map across the site, which tells us, for those background flight flux, where are they going to happen on the site. Combining those two gives us a value at each turbine location that directly tells us the number of interactions that we're expecting at that location. From that, it's just one more step through band to calculate the number of collisions that we're expecting. So this has been a really helpful process in a lot of our wind farms, and particularly on this site. I mean, I was in meetings with engineers over and over looking at different site layouts and actually really testing our assumptions around, the quantifying the benefit of avoiding where the eagles were flying versus, their engineering constraints that they had. And that was also a process that was really transparent for the regulators, so it really demonstrated the care and the avoidance had happened. A similar approach is being used for bulgars. So this is a site out the west of Melbourne, where these little splotches here are wetlands. So this site, we have a breeding bulgar problem, where we know from historical records how often they're breeding at each one of these wetlands. We also had data about the distance flown from wetlands. On average, we were able to generate a distribution of distance flown from those wetlands, and also height as a function of distance. And from that, we could build up mathematically a spatial probability map that was able to also integrate into a collision risk model to give us a per turbine collision risk model that was used on microsighting and basically setting setback buffers for the bulgar breeding sites. But we're falling behind. A lot of this work was really developed a decade ago, and we're not incorporating the models that we use in Australia at the moment. Predominantly don't incorporate stochastic inputs. They're not accounting for variable risk with height, etc., etc. As turbines get bigger and the layout gets more complex, we really need to look into these things. And we really, really need to do it soon. So a couple of things have changed. On the regulatory front, at both the state and Commonwealth level, or federal level, traditionally there's been a bit of reticence about collision risk model for whatever reason. All of a sudden, there's been a number of guidelines, both at the federal level and at a couple of states, which are really encouraging collision risk models for a range of species, sometimes without really understanding of, the data challenges around that. So we've gone from the floodgates being closed to being wide open. We also have development in areas that haven't been developed before. So over in the west, we've got black cockatoos, where we know very little about. We're needing to collect data very, very quickly. Over in the east, we've got an overlay with the East Asian flyway. So we've got species like the white-throated needletail, which is really difficult because it can be on site anytime in kind of a 5-month period. It might not be there at all, or it might be there in its hundreds. And understanding that variability, we also know from post-construction monitoring that they do strike, they are a risk, but quantifying that and quantifying that in terms of collecting data is really difficult, but also quantifying that in terms of having a modelling platform that really accounts for that variability is something that keeps me up at night at the moment. We've also for the first time got a bunch of permit areas that have opened up for offshore, and we've got some really unique and really diverse species in the offshore environment in Australia. Shy albatross, we know very little about it. Short-tail shearwater, they're very numerous, but the breeding sites for the entire world population are just down off the southern coast of Australia. So it's really critical that we understand what's going on. So to date, we really need to sort of be able to incorporate spatial inputs, uncertainty, and a platform for landscape scale modelling and the next generation of agent-based models. So something I'm really excited about, and I'm lead author on, so I'm going to spruik it, is a soon-to-be-released R package called Collison. It's in private beta testing at the moment, so if you want to be involved, just flip me an email. It's really designed to be a platform for modular collision risk development. So it's got methods for band and meiosis, it's stochastic inputs, per turbine calculations. There's a paper and data collection guidance paper coming out soon. We're going to try and get that published soon. When that's published, we'll make the whole thing open source. And that's really, I'm hoping that and conversations like today really help us get a handle around like the next generation in Australia. So thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts or want to be involved in any of those projects, let me know. And I'll hand back over to the rest of the world. Thanks.
All right, Thank you very much, Liz. All right, so panel, come on up here. Yeah, please.
Do you mind turning those mics on?
All right, so we have a relatively short panel time here. We have about 15 minutes until the end of the session, but we're hoping we can get some good discussion in. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a all afternoon working group meeting tomorrow if this all sounds really cool and you want to talk more about this. But I think we have a nice group of folks here. As mentioned earlier, we kind of have some folks on the regulatory decision-making side. We have some folks on the technical side. Span a lot of issues. So if you have questions, send them in, and we will ask them. So I think one question that sort of comes up a lot with SCRAM, and I'm kind of curious how it's getting implemented in other regions as well. So I'd say, like, let's maybe direct this towards Stephanie and Julie, but then we can talk more about like how we think about this a bit, which is how do we deal with models as they evolve, right? Like, so as we add more data to a model or as we change a model's framework, right? How do we incorporate that into decision makings or regulatory contexts? And so there's a very specific question about that with like how we're doing that in the U.S., but I'm just kind of curious generally what thoughts are about like how the U.K. has been doing this and what we're thinking about doing here.
It's kind of a big question. I suppose for us it depends on the evidence base in general that we have that have merited the change both to the tool, but what are the improvements? Are they functionally important such that they're going to either increase transparency, increase standardization for our developers' assessments, or are they ecologically sort of important? And even in a small country like the UK, between Scotland and England, we can have very different guidance and evidence bases for the same species, for example, based on the information that we have from studies from them. So for us, in terms of updating and sort of evaluating evidence as the best available, it really depends how it's applied insofar as whether or not it's useful for assessment. It could be really local scale specific as well, to be honest. Stephanie?
Yeah, so the Fish and Wildlife Service uses the best available scientific information to analyze impacts and to issue our biological opinions. And as additional and new information comes in, we incorporate that into our analysis so that we are making sure that we're doing the best that we can to make reasonable judgments on what the impacts could be or can be into the future. A lot of these projects, we only see them maybe once for a consultation, and so we try to do the best that we can with the information that we have available to ensure that the documents that we produce are consistent, they're going to stand the test of time, and they're going to hopefully lead to the recovery of species, because that's the goal at the end of the day. If it's a listed species, the goal is that it's going to be recovered. So we don't want to have a bunch of projects out there that we're not incorporating new information about and have and potentially impact the recovery of our species.
So, Stephanie, just like a follow-up there, are we going to have to, like, our project, generators, developers, are they going to have to continue to sort of reopen discussions every time we add new data to SCRAM or add more decision into that decision-making context?
Oh, that's a great question. All right, I see where we're going here. Got it. All right. The service is not interested in being in perpetual reinitiation on a project. It might surprise you, but we have a pretty big workload. And this is work. This is important work. So if the service and you, project proponents, consult on a project and it's decided that we're going to go into a formal consultation, generally what we've been doing when we issue our biological opinions is we say something along the lines of, we're going to run SCRAM every year for the first 3 years, and then years 4 through 10 every other year. And or if a better model becomes available, different information becomes available, or we've decided that we no longer need to run the model because X, Y, and Z happens. Or maybe the project, doesn't move forward. So that touch point is because there's a lot of information that we do not know, and because those models are being incorporated, new updates are happening. We want to be able to analyze that and make sure that when we issued the biological opinion the first time, we got it right. Because new information is important, and we need to be thinking about it and analyzing that. So we're not looking to be in reinitiation on an annual basis or at year 5 or at year 10, but we are interested in incorporating the newest available information to ensure that the biological opinion we issue to you is consistent and it was not wrong, right? That's the whole point. We're trying to make sure that we stay within our regulations and ensure that you guys are able to do the work that you're interested in doing, that you want to be doing, without having compliance concerns.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, Liz, I noticed that in your jurisdiction, you've been changing collision risk models a fair bit. I know you're not on the regulatory side of these things, but I was kind of curious to see what sort of effects you saw of sort of updating, advancing models, trying different things, not using band, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, in our jurisdiction, it's more about on a case-by-case basis, adjusting the inputs. So at its core, I think we're all running something that's very similar to band. But it's about how you once a process is tested on a site, it can then be reused on other sites using that same agreed process. And we don't have the same level of regulatory probably guidance on what needs to be used. So sometimes it is left up to industry for better or worse. Just one thing that is really challenging at the moment actually is our need for data across multiple sites, because we are very site-by-site focused in Australia, and there's very little collaboration between those proponents. It's very, very hard to get things like repositories of flight heights and stuff like that. That's our current challenge.
Thanks. So I think moving on to like the topic of uncertainty, these models have been made stochastic recently, which just means we're adding variance and parameters into these things. I'm kind of curious, Aonghais, because you've kind of done these like high level reviews of all these different collision risk models. Like, have you seen kind of like how folks are trying to take these the uncertainty in these estimates and use them, or like how has this sort of like changed over time, perhaps?
I mean, I think it's quite challenging. I mean, I think initially the sort of approach to dealing with uncertainty was supposed to be, well, you take your best case scenario and you take your worst case scenario and you model both and see what you get the answer to. I think with the more stochastic things, you can use like sort of simulation approaches to sample from distributions of the different parameters, and that sort of maybe gives you a sort of clearer overall picture. And I think a sort of key advantage of that type of approach is then that as you collect more and better data, the sort of bounds of uncertainty around those parameters get reduced, hopefully, and that sort of helps you sort of hone in on what you think the reasonable answer might be. I think it's still a bit up for debate how to use those sort of uncertainty estimates within the regulation process. I think generally there's a sort of, you use the worst case scenario, but I think there's still quite a bit of debate around that. I think Julie here. Yes.
I suppose so. I'll just immediately caveat this with my statutory colleagues at NatureScot make a lot of this guidance. So yeah, I suppose as Aonghais has really pointed out, we understand that we have imperfect knowledge of our ecological parameters and our wind farm parameters relative to project proposals. And so just having a way of observing that uncertainty in the estimates that are returned from a collision risk model gives decision makers a general platform, I guess, to establish what the potential for impacts looks like across all of these uncertainties, both within the sort of design of the wind farm itself, but also in the lack of information we have on the species. And from that, you can start to make sort of educated evidence-based assessments of what then, for us, the population impact would be. But I don't know if Stephanie wants to say more on individual impacts, because we look across populations.
If you want to talk.
Yeah, so we need to make sure that the work that's being done, renewable energy projects, whatever project it is that we're consulting on, isn't going to jeopardize the existence of a species. And so basically that's what we're working towards, right? We're working to make sure that it's going to be there for as long as it should be there. Uncertainty causes concerns, right? The less data you have, the harder it is to make a reasonable decision or to make an informed decision. And so whenever project proponents come to us and they're like, what can we do to help increase, your certainty in this situation or to decrease the risk of us being out of compliance, then generally what we're going to recommend is that they do baseline monitoring and surveys so that when they come into consultation with us, we can make an informed decision, a better informed decision. I don't think we'll ever have all of the information that we could want, but there is a lot of information that's out there and it's available, and additional information that needs to be acquired so that we can help reduce the amount of risk, reduce the amount of uncertainty, and make decisions that are longstanding and, beneficial for both the species and the industry that we're consulting with.
Excellent, thanks. So on the topic of monitoring and think about what we need, I want to direct this initially to Andrew, but I think everyone can kind of weigh in on this, which is Andrew's been in the weeds on thinking about this round of model updates. And so I think the kind of two-part question here is what do we need to know? What are our highest priority bits of information out there for a collision risk model like a band/SCRAM model? And how do we develop monitoring plans or research plans to help us get that information? So I think maybe start with the first bit, and then we can talk as a group about the second bit.
Well, that's pretty loaded. Well, I mean, we know, you saw the slide with all the parameters. You saw it from Aonghais as well. I mean, we know that for these collision risk models, obviously avoidance rates, not obviously to many, but if you've heard talks over the time, that often gets identified as one of the biggest drivers of collision estimates. But it's also the biggest uncertainty. But how do you can't estimate collision, of course, without monitoring for collision. And currently, in a nascent field, we don't have turbines even. I mean, they're just starting to go out. There's been some in Europe, but we don't necessarily have overlapping species. But we need to do a lot to try and understand better and drill down on, and estimate those avoidance rates for species like red knot or for piping plover or even roseate tern. So that's a big one. But then just continuing, even though we have this beautiful, nice new data set for GPS tagged animals, it's still a tiny number of animals we're trying to track relative to the population. So we're making an assumption that's representative, but that's hard to know exactly always how representative it is. And we do know that the more data we collect across, its range, and we understand its total movement patterns across the population, the better understanding we have of use offshore.
Yeah. I think so. More tracking data, that's always good, particularly for SCRAM. Not as helpful for the base band models, but these avoidance rates, these are such challenges. I think Aonghais, you've been probably at the forefront of a lot of thinking about avoidance rates. Why aren't we better at this? Why don't we know more about avoidance rate?
So I mean, I think a big part of the challenge is there's a slight misconception about what avoidance rates are, and it's not helped by them being called avoidance rates. Because it suggests that avoidance rates are just purely down to the avoidance behaviour of the bird, but they're not. I mean, the way they're calculated is by comparing the observed number of collisions to the number of collisions you would expect from the model if there's no avoidance whatsoever. So that introduces this sort of degree of circularity, and if there's all sorts of problems in the model, then it's going to overestimate the sort of number of collisions you'd expect with no avoidance, and that's going to sort of do funny things to the avoidance rates that you then plug back into the model. So I think one of the things we need to do is start thinking a bit more about how to incorporate observed data from wind farms into the into the sort of calculations, observed collision rates, observed behavioural responses, which you can get at from things like radar and GPS tracking, and just start thinking about how that can be used to sort of better inform risk. So,
yeah. So last question, then I'm gonna direct a little bit towards Liz. Liz, you have a new R package that's almost out yet. Have you figured out the avoidance weight problem for us, or no?
No, I was nodding along there with Angus, and it's a massive problem, and it really needs that connection between the collision risk modelling to start with, and then the post-construction monitoring. We have a giant lot of post-construction monitoring in Australia, but we don't have as many sites that have had collision risk modelling beforehand. So we're kind of in the opposite problem to the rest of the world. So we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. The story
you'll know when we know.
Yeah, so if this energizing discussion sounds fun to you, again, tomorrow we're having our working group meeting. We're trying to get some consistency across international boundaries on how we're working with collision risk models. We're trying to create shared databases and shared information so that we can kind of get these right. So look forward to seeing some of you there, hopefully. And otherwise, thank you to our panel for the presentations and the excellent discussion, and thank you for paying attention. Bye, Liz. Thank you. Get some sleep.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Hey, real quick announcement for folks who are at the Hyatt Regency. So that's the farthest away hotel.